My name is Harry Whitehead. I am an author of prose fiction. I'm also an academic and I teach creative writing and literature here at the University of Leicester. Before that I worked for some 15 years in the film business, mostly as a technician or in film production rather than at the grand heights of being a director or writer. I worked for some years as a first assistant director, the guy who runs the film shoot, and then I ended up as, for the most of my career, as a location manager. Location manager runs the logistics, manages the whole shoot, the kind of how things work. He also scouts and finds all the locations where you film, and I did that for many years. I worked in pretty much all formats, everything from music videos to television commercials to movies, small and big, American and British, French movies. In the last few years of my life I was mostly working as a location manager in TV commercials because the money's there, you get paid very well indeed, and it financed me to pursue my writing. I was writing my first novel and I was pursuing a PhD, so I'd have 4, 6, 8 weeks working on a TV commercial under the most amazing kind of stress and pressure, and that would free me up to have a similar amount of time to go and sit in the British Library and research and write. It's one of those, it's an industry that's kind of rich in anecdotes that are great after the event, but at the time are mostly exercises in pain, fear and loathing because of the kind of stress you're under. A film shoot has to happen and a location manager has to fit a film crew into the real world, and that's what, that's pretty tricky. It's a square peg in a round hole. There's always the neighbour's, cat has always just died the day before, and you say you can't go and put that 18k lamp that she promised that you could put in the back garden that was going to light the kitchen for the shoot that day. There's always something like that going on. But I guess some of the highlights were travelling. I worked on this enormous television commercial once, which was shooting in 45 countries, and I was UK and the Indian location manager, and I spent 17 days scouting all through Rajasthan up to the Thar Desert, all the palaces and schools and sort of village temples and all kinds of stuff, and right up into the Himalayas and into Ladakh. My highlight ever, I think my greatest scout day, which would never be beaten, was watching the sun come up from the highest motorable road in the world at 19,000 feet in Ladakh and photographing the Himalayas, and then driving for 5 hours down this terrifying road and being plonked on an aeroplane straight to Delhi. And by lunchtime I was standing in a police box on Chandni Chowk, the busiest street in the world, 110 degrees, photographing the traffic and the carnage of the traffic going to and fro. So it was a job of extremes and experience and constant problem solving. We had to get, for the Ladakh shoot in the Himalayas, we had to get 150 crew from Bombay and all the trucks and technical equipment up to Ladakh, which was 7 days drive for a day's filming, and then driving about 7 days back. Find a military airport, land some of the other equipment because we couldn't use the ordinary airport when we were up in Rajasthan, for instance, paying off the military in order to be able to land a couple of planes, things like that, which gave me an awful lot of life experience that I am certainly planning to plough into the fiction I continue to write for the rest of my life. Why did I leave it? Well, to be honest, I fell into it. I'd done a Master of Science in Medical Anthropology, completely something different, right? And I'd come out the back end of that job, of that master's degree. I was kicking around. I was about to possibly start a very scientific PhD with a psychiatrist in East London, looking at cross-cultural approaches to psychiatric care among newly immigrant communities in East London. And the same week I was offered that paid PhD, I was offered a job through a friend scouting a small low-budget film. And I was 30 years old, had to weigh up the two options, which way to go. And I went for the glory. And I took the scouting job and didn't do the PhD. So it kind of happened through circumstance. And I fell into it, and I was a bit older. I lived for many years in the Far East in my 20s. I had quite a lot of life experience. I drove a van in London all through my teenage years, delivering wine. So I knew London like the back of my hand, which location scouts need to know their way around, need to be able to take photographs. So suddenly I was a location scout and then an AD, and that 5 years went by, and I was making a pile of money. And I woke up going, hang on, around age 34 or so, I always wanted to be a writer or an academic. What's going on? And so I went off and I got onto an MA in creative writing at Birkbeck in London, the University of London. And I pursued that, which put pay to my engagement. The woman I was engaged to at the time, who didn't like the idea of me not being a businessman and a money maker and blah blah, and that split us up. But I got my MA, and I went on and started this PhD around the time I was starting this novel, and the two kind of coincided, and I did this creative writing PhD by distance learning in Lancaster, whilst I was still location managing full-time in London. So I'd commute to Lancaster. I did a bit of teaching creative writing as well, so I'd have to sneak off shoots and pretend I was scouting somewhere whilst I was on a train to Lancaster to teach undergraduates creative writing, and just kind of spent the last 5, 6, 7 years, I guess, altogether, really kind of waking back up to the fact that I'd always actually wanted to write and research and be an academic, really. And I hadn't even initially planned on being a novelist per se, but I had this pet project which became my first novel, which I'd been interested in since my mid-20s. And it was the reason I'd gone and done a master's degree in medical anthropology, which maybe I should tell the story of. Okay, yeah. It was the story of a shaman who, a reluctant shaman, that I'd read in an academic piece sometime in the 1870s in British Columbia in Canada. This guy had gone to become a shaman in order to expose the lies and trickeries of shamanism, the fraudulence of shamanism. And he learned all these arts of jiggery-pokery and prestidigitation and ways to kind of throw the wool over sick people's eyes as he saw them lies and tricks. And then a local chieftain had a dream that only he could save his sick grandson. In fact, the grandson had had the dream, and so very reluctantly this guy goes and performs this ritual of healing, which he sees as all these tricks and lies, and of course, lo and behold, the child is cured. So that story just stuck with me. Who was this guy? Why was he suspicious? Why did this story end up in an anthropological tome 20th century. You know, who was he? I wanted to find out. I wanted to find out what ritual healing meant, what happens. On a personal note, I'd broken my back. I'd spent 2 years learning to walk. I pretty much had a nervous breakdown, trying to emotionally get my head around the pain and the trying to take control of my physical body again. So I think one can kind of read into my motivation for being interested in this story. So I go to British Columbia in Canada. I track down this story and I discover that this guy's father was a white man, mother was a native Canadian first person princess, and so this guy, this half caste as he called it, would have called himself back then, grew up in two worlds, and so really in neither, right in the middle of the colonial era. And he had been a shaman and a chieftain among his mother's people, but he'd also been a white scientist, an assistant to all these anthropologists. So he had these completely dual personalities that he couldn't marry together. So all his writings all kind of have these different swinging shifts of points of view. And it seemed such a fascinating subject. And I just became more and more obsessed with him. And it stayed with me all through the years. I was being a location manager and staying up till 6 in the morning doing coke and drinking heavily, and gosh, and me telling you this, and going to all the sort of film parties and all doing the kind of things that London filmmakers do. Actually, I wanted to write this guy's story. And so that just never went, and it came back, and I had to do it. I had to write the story. So that's how I ended up doing this PhD. How it ended up turning itself initially from a biography into a novel, because in the end I realised it was very specific elements of this guy's story were what interested me. So I concatenated his life, drew elements of his life into this sort of narrative that I think and I hope, some critics have agreed, some haven't, kind of retains the truth of his life, if not the accurate facts of his life. Because I think, we all of us live in a time of fractured identities now, multiple identities that we all have to inhabit. Identities that make us say yes when we answer a question one day in one context, and no when we're asked the same question a following day in a different context, and believe both answers as if they're the God's own truth. And that, what is it? What that multiplicity of identities, cultural and social identities that we actually live with all the time, doesn't match how we appear or how we have to think about what our identity is, which is as some kind of whole, some entirety that remains the same and is essential. So this guy's life, his name was George Hunt, by the way, this guy's life seemed to represent so many of those aspects of fragmentation and split identity. And I'd been interested in that, I'd been interested in him. Bang, they came together and eventually constructed this novel I wrote. Well, from the first time I read the story the first time to the end of the first draft was about 17 years. When I finally sat down and wrote the first word till the end of the first draft was about 8-9 months, and it took me probably 2.5 years to write a draft that was good enough to send out to people. And my wonderful writer wife Anita eventually just forced the issue. Said, no, don't write another bloody word. Get that script, send it out, and stop faffing around. Well, I mean, historical context is always difficult. I did, the bibliography to my novel, runs to 30 odd pages. I read hundreds and hundreds of texts, old text, primary sources, original newspapers. The research was just vast to try and get my head around what it was like to be a First Nations person, or a person who wasn't First Nations, who was half First Nations, half white. The whole coastline was full of Russians, Americans, English, First Nations people, Japanese, whaling people, all kinds of mix and match of cultures. And to try and reflect that period, that time, accurately, to try and construct the voices of all those people in all those coming from all these different places. How did they swear? Most of them were working class poor people. They'd swear and curse. How did they all swear and curse? Nobody wrote that anywhere, at the time in the 19th century. So how to reconstruct the voices and how to make it authentic, not just to the truth of the matter, but to the truth of how we as readers in the 21st century would consider something authentic. That's not something writers are often honest about. But all history is the history of the present, partly. So you both have to construct an authentic past, but also one that is intelligible to the readership of the present. And that was extremely complex to try and work out what was right and what was wrong. And I think I probably did it pretty well in places and not so well in others. It's been much discussed, certainly in Canada, in reviews, whether it works or whether it doesn't. So I think that was probably the hardest thing. I think the easiest, not the easiest, but the most satisfying. I've just been asked this for the paperbacks just coming out, and they're doing a kind of readers groups guide in the back of the book, questions for readers groups to ask and questions for me as the author. What was the most challenging, what was the most interesting? So I've been thinking about this, and what is still the most interesting thing about the book for me is how I inhabited the geography of the place I was writing about. British Columbia is mountains, is forests, is huge fjords and the Pacific Ocean coming in, and great storms and cedar woods, and this incredible kind of epic landscape that my novel is set against. When it was going well, there I was in the British Library, with the dense forest around me as I was writing, having to learn all the fronds and the brackens and the different trees and the fauna, what kind of ducks would land on a lake in March in British Columbia, things like this. And as that all comes into you, you begin to inhabit it. And that's why when a writer has begun to write, they can't ever stop. Because the addiction of achieving that moment, of reaching that point, which you don't often, where you are really inhabiting a space, it kind of you just sort of open slightly. Your consciousness just expands just a little bit, and it's an addiction like no other. You spend 99% of your life faffing around, filing paperwork and doing this and that, and failing to write well, and waiting to get back to that space somehow. I think the process of writing is as it's discussed, is often about the process of starting to get up and writing. Once you're really there, you can write at any time, anywhere. But a routine for me was important, and it was mostly for me. I lived in Kentish Town in London. I'd get up, get on my bicycle, cycle to the British Library, have a cup of coffee. By 10 o'clock I'd be up on the third floor in the Science 3, which is the quietest section of the British Library, at one of the desks there, and I'd sit down and sort of breathe, and I'd do it however I felt. This notion that inspiration has anything to do with anything is what amateur writers deal with. Professionalising yourself is to write whatever mood you're in at the time your routine tells you must write. Because I think it was Somerset Maugham, when he was asked if he had to wait for inspiration, he said, "Inspiration, my boy, comes every morning at 9 a.m. sharp." And it's true. I wrote some of the best stuff I ever wrote in the worst kind of moods, uncreative moods. You just have to bloody well do it. That's the only advice really I have to writers, is until there's something on the page, you have nothing. And for a first-time writer who has that special story that they've always wanted to write, they have a notion that somehow the first draft of it has to be great, that the first time it pours itself out, it has to be great. Ernest Hemingway said the first draft of anything is shit. It's true. You know, writing is rewriting. It's over and over again. My first page must have been edited 50 times, 100 times. It wasn't even in the same person in the end. It was in the first person. I started it in the second person, and then it was in the third person, and then there was another character turned up, and it became a novel about two characters, and then the novel was in the first person and the third person. You know, it evolved, it changed. I had a load of visual, I visualise things. I visualise scenes, that's probably from film, and I write everything scenically. There's never anything in my novels kind of that says, for 3 days they travelled across the desert, blah blah. Everything is always set in a specific moment. You might have a flashback saying it had taken them 3 days to get here, but each thing is a scene. And I saw a number of scenes. I saw a man in a canoe on a fjord in British Columbia with the fog beginning to come down, and suddenly a killer whale rises up right next to the boat, arcs up, and the tail comes up and goes down totally silently right next to him. And I saw a Circus of the Grotesque in 1900 in the middle of Central Park, with my native Canadian First Nations guy walking through it, just here in the very church of reason, you know, the heart of rationality as he had it described in the big city of New York. Here at its very heart was a circus of the grotesque, all the dark spirits of the nighted forest, all this kind of, so it was kind of an anti-Heart of Darkness novel in many ways. But I knew I needed to get to that circus of the grotesque somehow, via him, you know, with his killer whale coming up and down, and a couple of other visual scenes I had. And so I would write towards those scenes. Mostly I wrote on the computer, but not always. Some things have to come out longhand, and then they get transcribed, but most of the novel was on the computer. I had that 1,000 words a day trip. That's a good one. It's a classic, isn't it, of writing? You know, 1,000 words a day. Churchill said it. Others have said it since. That's how you write. 1,000 words a day. Graham Greene wrote 500 words a day, every day. for me, I was thinking 1,000 words a day. And I would just sit there until I had. Sometimes I'd be done by 11. I'd have written 2,500 words in an hour. And sometimes I'd have written 600 words by 5 p.m, having been there since 10. I'd just sit there until I'd done it, until I'd done something. And it's interesting because I'm in the process of trying to get my second novel up and running now, and it's much harder. A new academic. I'm the first creative writer here in this department, so I'm having to found creative writing to get it up and running from scratch, if you like, and not quite from scratch, that's unfair to my colleagues, but it's tough. I've got to learn to be an academic as well, because I was doing my PhD by distance learning. I've never been in an academy before. I had no idea what was going on. When I got the interview for Leicester, and not many people in this department know this fact, but I'd finished my PhD, I was down on my luck, I'd finished my novel, I'd found a literary agent, they had no contract, no nothing. And I'd got another job as a location manager, working on a TV commercial for Butlins. And I was down at this holiday camp on the south coast in Bognor Regis, filming this TV commercial with this giant green furry dragon walking round this holiday camp that I was location managing when I got the interview. And I hopped on a train, pretended I was going somewhere, and came up here and was interviewed all day in this very sort of oppressive academic environment, and then hopped off back down to my green furry dinosaur on the south coast. So it's been tough to learn the job and to write and to find the kind of routine that I've been describing. You have to get up and running. Once you're up and running, doesn't matter. You can write any time. But I haven't found it yet for my second novel. Penguin have paid me a pile of money for it, and it's due at the end of the year. There are general influences one has as a writer. Virginia Woolf, is just the most magnificent writer of prose. To the Lighthouse is just still one of the most stunning pieces of writing I've ever come across. Moby Dick is the same. There are a few others. Anyway, I could go on. There are a few others that generally affect me. But there were a number of novels specific to the writing of my first novel that have nothing to do with the writing of my second, for instance, but helped me get going. And I think this is most interesting to talk about in terms of literary influences. How does one, number one, imitate, but number two, respond to creatively another work? And one does a little bit of both to different kinds of texts. Now, Little Big Man by Thomas Berger, which became a movie and is the story of a white little boy who is taken by a First Nations tribe in the US, and he ends up at the Little Big Horn, the battle with Custer, and it's a kind of picaresque of his life, and it's a marvellous piece of writing, and it's such a piss take of America's perspective or lack of perspective on its own Aboriginal culture, if you like. It's a wonderful piece of writing. And then Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, when I read it, was so visceral in its prose and so terrible and so visual that I was just stunned, and I just wanted to write like it. And that and Mario Vargas Llosa's book The Way to Paradise, about Gauguin in Tahiti, which is written partly in the second person, as only Latin American writers seem to be able to do. You step out, don't you, and you look at her, you watch the fine curves of her body move, blah blah blah. Yeah. Oh, I thought, that's so great, he's so clever, ooh, I want to write like this. So, Blood Meridian, Vargas Llosa second person, I start typing. I must have written the first 60, 70 pages of the novel kind of in this sort of overblown Cormac McCarthy-esque style with little slips into the second person. And then I kind of settled into writing with a little bit of a firmer personal voice. And by the time I got 80% into the novel and was getting towards the close, I realised that the opening of the novel, with all that kind of baggage attached to it, meant that I couldn't finish the novel because I didn't have the style and substance of my own voice firmly enough in place throughout the novel to allow me to finish. So I had to stop. And my wife was very angry with me. She said, don't go back, never go back, go forward, always move forward until you've written the end and then go back. But I couldn't, and I had to go back and rewrite those first 80 pages or so in my own voice, in my own way that I wanted to write it. And then go back to the end, and I could write that big scene in New York that I was talking about where he ends up in the Circus of the Grotesque, which again was rewritten about 50 times in the end. But it allowed me to finish. So one's literary influences work at a number of different levels. It's been called a kind of a Canadian heart of darkness, my book, which is annoying because, like I said, it's a sort of anti-heart of darkness, because the dark wilderness and all this kind of nonsense is actually what he finds in the Church of Reason itself, right in the middle of New York in 1900. That's where, the real weirdness is going on, not in the forests of his home where sense is being made, but there amid these crazy freak shows that, kind of Western culture was obsessed with at the time, and the material cultures of the other being drawn in and placed into these museums. So he wanders the Natural History Museum among all the kind of cultural artifacts from Africa and from British Columbia, and he kind of wanders amongst them. They're all kind of random and pieces here and there, and what the hell do they all mean? Then he walks out and he walks into Central Park and he walks into a Circus of the Grotesque, and there in the middle of the Circus of the Grotesque, chained to the floor, is the wild man. The guy's been covered in fur or something, and it's just some guy from the Bronx. He's going rah at everybody, and of course he stands there in the middle of this tent, just looking at this guy, going, "What the hell? I've told you the end of the book, damn it!" And I'm getting carried away. Yeah. But yeah, my literary influences were kind of got me going, got me up and running. Most of my influences for the book were, of course, primary historical material, but style-wise, they were those. Not Conrad, actually. I hadn't read Heart of Darkness until I finished the book. I never read it. My name is Harry Whitehead. I am an author of prose fiction. I'm also an academic, and I teach creative writing and literature here at the University of Leicester. My first novel. It's called The Cannibal Spirit. It's not published in the UK yet. It's still only published in Canada. Negotiations continue in the UK. It's called The Cannibal Spirit, set in 1900. It's about my character George Hunt's trial on charges of cannibalism, which is a true story, and it's a kind of a fictionalization of the events surrounding his trial, and it's set from his point of view and also from the point of view of his son-in-law Harry Cadwallader, who is based on a real figure, but there was a guy called Harry Cadwallader, but I have completely fictionalized his life. And George Hunt loses a son, buries his son in the First Nations manner rather than the Christian manner of his father, enrages the missionaries who concoct these charges against him. He flees into the wilderness. Harry Cadwallader must go and try and find him. But Harry Cadwallader is very reluctant. So that's kind of the story, if you like, in outline. I'm interested in how we construct knowledge, and I'm very interested in the Enlightenment and the basic premise of scientific reason, which is a very sound one for me, which is evidence, and the reproduction of if you can reproduce an experiment exactly somewhere else, you can make a statement about the truth or otherwise of it, is incredibly compelling, and has become, or at least it did in the 19th century, its own form of religion in some ways. And so what is it that we need? I don't know if I'm articulating myself brilliantly here, but what do we need? What do we desire that can find a solution in that, as it can find a solution in ritual healing and shamanism, in religious faith? So, what is it to be? To be an agnostic is one thing, but to be an atheist, I guess by my faith is atheism. But it's a faith that there is no God, and that when I die, I stop. I find great succour in that fact. There's no, my fear of death dissipates immediately. That I say to myself, there's not going to be any me going, oh no, you're dead. Then I'm free. I'm liberated to exist in the moment. It's a form of faith. But it's a faith based upon, in my own mind, rationality. And yet I'm constructing knowledge to my own ends here. So when I looked at George Hunt, who tells the story to this anthropologist, here was I going to become a shaman because it was all lies and trickeries. You see, and here they are. Here are all the lies and trickeries. I put a piece of eagle down in my mouth. I bite my lip halfway through the ceremony. I suck on the part of the person that one of my dreamers, the people who go and listen to the gossip of the people and bring the whispers back to tell the shaman, has told me is the place where they are ill. Oh, it hurts here, doctor. I say, here is the place that your illness is. I suck on that. I bite my lip. I put blood in the eagle down. I stand up. I spit the eagle down into my hand. I show it around to everybody, and then I put it in bark and burned it on the fire, and the illness is gone. And the child gets up the next day and it is healed. He says, so what happened there? Why is he healed? What's going on? The placebo effect, whatever the hell it is. That's fascinating to me. How does rationality work against process? Einstein's fourth dimension of time, if you like, of process, the thing against the process. This is turning slightly into an uncentered rant. You must forgive me.
It's fine. Because the ideas are fascinating.
Yeah, they're not ideas I have a solution to, but I think that at heart everything is motivated by finding a solution to our own mortality. everything that drives who we are, how the world functions, is based upon the fundamental premise of limit, of the limit of our consciousness and what that means to us. If you think about immortality, if you were given immortality in this very moment, you might dance around and go, oh wow, great. But then every single thing that means anything to who you are and how you function in your moment to moment would slowly entropize, cease to have any meaning of any sort until you just came to a halt, because it is limit that propels movement, if you like. Ernest Becker wrote a very famous book called The Denial of Death, won the Pulitzer Prize in '73, talks about this drive to deny death and to overcome death, to beat death, to solve death, and how it plays itself through every single level of who we are, be it in, shamanistic ritual, or be it in our understanding of cosmology. Somewhere in this is the motivation that is driven by the limit of our consciousness. I sound more like Krishnamurti than I do an academic at the moment, maybe.
No, it's fine. Because, even when you talk of rationality or scientific reasoning, you also find that even that had its roots in something very, very akin to shamanism. Because the early scientists were not only scientists, but they were also philosophers. And they were also dabbling in the occult, and some of them from that, they left that and developed other lines of inquiry.
Absolutely.
Which became...
Paracelsus, Erasmus, John Dee, absolutely. Or, science was born of that kind of, mystical inquiry, of magical inquiry, if you like. I mean, to say it remains the same thing, I think, is to fall into a space that is rather limited in its understanding of what science does now. But for me, how we find an answer to the process of our life. My character George Hunt in my novel, I did one of the things that my editors took issue with was that with one of my characters I had a nice 3-act structure for them, character arc, and they resolve. They live happily ever after, basically. But for George Hunt, every time he thinks he's found a solution, I'm a white man, I'm a scientist, oh great, I'm a shaman, I'm a chieftain, I'm one of my people, I'm going to defend them to the end of my existence, great. Every single time he decides he's one or the other, he's flipped upside down by the world, by circumstance. And right at the end, he's flipped upside down again. And people say, this is not satisfying. Resolve him. And I just wouldn't. I absolutely wouldn't. I left the ending open. Just as you think he's in the court of law and he gets up and he says what he says and he is what he is, and you think, oh, great. Okay. There's the scene in New York and he's flipped upside down again. Because that's what goes on with our identity. Actually, we are a river, we are not a rock. And the acceptance of the riverness of who we are is the acceptance of ourselves, is our ability to begin to be at peace with ourselves. And I mean, that sounds highly spiritual. And as if when I was up in the Himalayas, I wasn't actually photographing TV commercial. I was sitting there going, oh, like this. But if I've realised anything, it's that I am rarely the same person on any 2 days. Yeah, I have the same quirks. Have the same quirks and ins and outs and ups and downs, but I'm much, much slower to judgment than ever I used to be when I was young. And it's simply through the recognition of what came in that first book, which was that, I might answer yes to a question and yes to the same question and no to the same question the next day and mean them both equally. And, I think one has to recognise that about oneself and try and look at the reasons why that is. We in the West, whatever the fuck the West is now, there's not anything really, but the modernity, ultra-modernity, wants solidification of self. It desires it in the narrative we have to construct about ourselves in all the multiple medias that are around us. It makes statements about we are this, we are that. We're not. We are at the moment, but we're not for long. Do not ask me who I am. Do not ask me to remain the same, said Michel Foucault beautifully. And that runs more true for me than anything. And it's what my next novel's about as well. It's probably going to be what all my novels are about.
What would you want a person watching this to take away?
Well, I'd like them to take away that I'm not quite the Eastern mystic that I seem to have turned myself into in this discussion. But it's been really interesting actually to articulate this, especially at the moment I'm just starting my next novel. But if I had anything I wanted to say, and I guess people who are going to watch this are potentially going to be people who want to write, who want to, kind of be writers. I would say don't try and be a writer, but write or don't, and look at why you write, and be careful of what you want, because once you get into it, once you start writing and you've achieved the space I was talking about at the beginning, once or twice, you're stuck with it for good. And the established publishing industry is destroying itself at the moment and won't continue for very long as it is. So have a think about your aspirations, what they mean to you, what it is that you want from it. In the end, John Gardner says, it does all boil down to glory. Any writer wants glory. They want critical and financial success, ideally, but certainly critical success. Most writers, most student writers, most writers I've ever met haven't got a lot to say. So I focus an awful lot more on the world and your place in it and experience and your journey through life, all these kind of things, living, soaking it up, being a participant observer in life, than I would on reading 20 how-to books on creative writing. I've got a whole piles of them here. They're all so much bullshit, really. They're fine for a second draft or a third draft. Great. Oh dear, I need to edit this and make it better. That's fine. If you want to be a writer, you have to fill yourself with life. That's the only way. Not fill yourself full of some fantasy of what being a writer is.
And for those people who are neither this nor that, like, or who think they are not this, and who also think they are not that, like the main character in your novel, what would you tell them?
Be both. Be all of them. Accept the multiplicity. It's more complex, but it's a lot more fun. Don't be so determined that you're right about everything. Don't be so determined to have an opinion. This is our culture now. I'm talking about our culture here now, television culture, you might call it. Is so determined that everyone should have an opinion. And of course that opinion should be able to be stated in 90 seconds in a soundbite length of time, as Noam Chomsky makes the point so well. If you haven't got an opinion about something, lean back, laugh, love the fact that you have no opinion on something. Be wrong, go down in flames, laugh when you do. Don't be afraid to not know. Don't be afraid to be wrong one day and right the next day. Let it flow, let yourself flow. Be fortune's fool. God knows it's more fun.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.